One, two, three.
Welcome to Scéalta. My name is Joe Austin. And let me remind those who have just joined us this evening, Scéalta is joint production of Fáilte Fierce to Hear and Feel and Fumble. My guest is someone who I've known for quite a long time. She's someone who, no matter when I meet her, never hesitates to give me good advice. And there's nothing as annoying as getting good advice. It's Quiery. So just to kind of paraphrase what your professionalism is, and then we'll deal with who you are. She's a senior psychotherapist. She has been a teacher. She has been a youth worker. She is an MA on women's studies. She is an advisor and has worked with something in the region of, I think, 50 or more statutory bodies, community groups. She has given advice around mental health. She has been a pioneer around LGBTQ rights. She is someone who has been to the forefront of fighting for her rights and other people's rights. And I want to take you through that. So I know I've left out about 20 awards, and you're telling me earlier on you've got very few, but I know that's not the case. But so, Mary, welcome to Scéalta. And I know you're not someone who blows their own trumpet, so that makes it all the more important that I was able to entice you to come on to the show. When we were doing some of the research about you, I was surprised to discover that you were born and lived in Newton Ards. And when I started to look at your story, it became clear that it was more Little House on the Prairie than the Railway Children. I know you're one of 6 children. So you take it from there, from Newton Ards. Tell me about you.
Yeah. Yes, there was 6 of us reared in Newton Ards. And I mean, I came from a very privileged background in that my father was the local Catholic GP. My mommy was a nurse. There was 6 of us in 9 years. So as time has gone on, there's very little difference between us. It was quite a crowded house. And we were always where my father said that, which I've yet to find evidence for, Joe, that Newton Ards was the home of the Renaissance, but he was very proud of the fact that there was at least 3, monasteries now derelict, and some of them just, bits of stones that were in Newton Ards. And he also reared us to be very proud of the Presbyterian tradition in terms of 1798. Some people would say that's the last time anything major happened in Newton Ards was 1798. But so we were reared to be very aware of that. We were also reared to be very proud of our Irish heritage. Did the Irish dancing and the whole works. We had great family parties, where people sang. Everybody had a party piece, even if you couldn't sing. So my childhood was very happy up until the point where my daddy died just about 3 weeks after his 50th birthday, and that totally changed everything. I still feel it, that I was very, very lucky. I suppose the major achievement in life was to get an education, and the 6 of us wouldn't have got an education if it hadn't been free.
Can I ask you a question? And it may seem an obvious question, you mentioned the parties at home that were quite enjoyable. I've heard you singing and reciting bits and pieces of poetry, and you're great crack. So obviously you were well groomed in the art of entertaining. Newton Ards isn't someone, although you're right in 1798 and the Hearts of Down and all of that period, but it isn't somewhere that I think would readily lend itself to an Irish Catholic identity. Was there difficulties growing up as a child? Did you feel that you were outside of your friends and neighbours?
Well, yeah, I suppose we were always the other. My kind of earliest memories as a child was that I was glad I wasn't a Protestant, because they weren't allowed to play out on a Sunday, whereas we were running up and down the street and screaming and shouting and, you know, having a ball. And there was a few sort of minor, it's funny, isn't it, how you pick things up? But I think there was some member of the royal family was visiting Newtonards sometime. This was in the 50s. And people were hanging out Union Jacks and stuff. And my mother realised shortly before the car was supposed to go past that we had just hung out the flags we had in the house, which was a tricolour, you know, and she very quickly went up and said, you know, no, take that down. But we weren't, we were kind of aware that we were outsiders. It was a very, very small Catholic community in Newtonards. And when they did set up a GAA team, you know, there was broken glass steamrollered into the pitch so that they couldn't use it after that. So there were difficulties, and I suppose we occasionally got stoned, but you know, I was never sure whether that was just we were in an area that we weren't supposed to be in. And as the eldest girl, I trailed around the three younger ones with me, and I must say it was more iron fist and velvet glove in terms of discipline, because, you know, I was dragging them to places where I knew we weren't supposed to go, and if they fell and hurt themselves, they weren't allowed to report it, you know, back at headquarters. So there's some ways it was great freedom, but we would never have been invited into anybody else's house. My father, when they had moved there, was one of the neighbours came and instructed him not to be given whiskey to her husband, whose my daddy had invited him in. So there was various things, but, you know, as a child, we were sent away to various grandparents who lived, you know, near Downpatrick for over the 12th, but it was never stated as that. But I suppose one of the other things, Joe, I remember from childhood, for which I'm eternally grateful, that we had all the kind of political heroes in our family were all female. That we had a great aunt who was very stylish and was great crack at parties, who was present for the first meeting of the Dáil, of Dáil Éireann. And she served various periods in jail. And I suppose we were never given political lectures as such, but we learned a lot about most of the Irish history I knew as a child was learnt at home. And we knew that De Valera wasn't a good man because he had put my Auntie Patsy in jail when she had a 6-week-old baby. And my great-grandmother went to Liberty Hall with the baby in her arms and went up onto the stage and said, "You have put the mother of this child in jail." Now, she was released the next day. But so there was quite a few women who did time in jail.
I mentioned in the introduction, and I'm going to come to it really at your pace, that there is within your blood this rich vein of protest and defence and defiance. And I want to come and I want to talk to it. But what I'm interested in just at the moment, you kind of went from a happy-go-lucky little girl, really the oldest of 6 when your father died prematurely, to mother's helper. And you were a co-partner in rearing the other 5 and supporting your mother. And I know you were very close to your father, and I know his memories are very, even to this day, quite raw with you. But did you feel a change? Did you feel that sense, that weight of responsibility on your shoulders?
Yeah, mainly, again, Joe, nobody tells you, you know, it's only later in life that you realise how things were. And I became my mother's confidant. She didn't, you know, so I didn't realise she talked to me about everybody else in the family. I presumed she did that with everybody else. So she, you know, she would, if she was discontented with somebody's behaviour, she would say to me, and then I would go to them and say, you know, Mommy's not happy with whatever. And that wasn't, you know, that wasn't always welcome by other members of the family. but I suppose the main thing was because there were 6 of us, and although my daddy had a good job by comparison to most people, he had no savings or anything. So it was very immediate change. And my mother was very lonely in Newtonards, and she, within 5 years, she moved back to Downpatrick and spent the rest of her days there. That's where they were originally from.
There was an incident that maybe you should recap for us, which I think perhaps explains some of this campaigning mode that you can go into very quickly. And you were refused access to the local soccer team when you were 8 because you had committed the mortal sin of being a girl.
Yeah, well, that was my first experience of sexism. And, to be honest, Joe, I have never understood it. I really don't get it, particularly in Ireland, where the women in my family were all very strong women. They didn't have much economic power, but and the men traditionally in the family seemed to have died young, and women were left rearing very large families on their own. But anyway, my brothers, my 4 brothers all played soccer, although they went on to play Gaelic as well. I very proudly had a brother who was on the Down team that won the league in the 80s. And my grandfather, apparently, this is all family lore, he was from Galway originally an Irish speaker, and he set up the first Down hurling team.
Very good. Very good.
Which has never gone on to win any great medals like myself. But anyway, I went along after school to the football practice. I didn't have football boots, but it's funny, I was a good wee left winger. I think that's quite funny. I don't think they use those terms anymore in football. And I, was dying to get on the team and ran up and down and faithfully went every week. And there was one week where there was 2 lads who were, I wasn't a wondrous footballer, but I was pretty fast. And these 2 lads got picked on the team, and I knew they were a lot worse than me. And I just walked off the pitch and never went back. And I didn't protest at that point. I didn't even say to my mother, I can still feel it, the injustice of it. And that was the last time I let an injustice go past me. I still feel it to this day. And I did go on to, a late developer. I did go on to winning a 5-a-side football tournament in Liverpool, of all places. So, I feel my life might have been very different. And I'm so pleased to see now that girls are so involved in sports.
University was Liverpool. So
no, the university was Coleraine. That was another education. Yeah, it was the new University of Ulster. I was there in its 2nd year. It was smaller than the school I went to, and the injustice of it being placed in Coleraine rather than Derry. And so we would, go up to Derry on a Saturday to get our fill of CS gas and to protest about, the injustice. And it's interesting because Coleraine never really took to the university. It should have been an opportunity. There's so many people with so many different talents. And because it was very small, you would get to know everybody, people in the NILP, the Labour Party. There's people in, the Irish Language Society. There was such a range of people. It was, I must say, I was very lucky in the education I got. And because it was a new university, it attracted a lot of teachers and lecturers who were quite, they were quite groundbreaking. And I remember coming home talking about the environment, and nobody had ever heard the word environment or ecology or any of those terms. So it was a very good education. I went to Liverpool subsequently to work.
That's where I've got it.
Yeah.
Did you, coming from that close-knit interdependent family, as I said, mother's helper, you call it mother's confidant, university. Was it a liberating experience? Were you lonely? Did you mix well?
I think, you know, Joe, I always felt different. And again, at that stage, you know, at 19, I didn't have anything to compare it to. So I think, and there was no support around grieving for my daddy. So, you know, if I had more than 2 drinks, I would end up being on my own somewhere. You know, hadn't finished grieving. He had only died a year before. So I found the first couple of years quite hard. And I wasn't very convinced. I felt I wasn't a very confident person. I wasn't very confident in my ability to even get a degree. And it was only really in my last year that I started to get a sense of understanding what this was all about. So it was lonely, and I can't say I travelled that far between Newtonards and Coleraine, but I did appreciate living by the sea, and it was as much, and I think younger people now miss out on that. For me, it was as much learning from the interesting people that I met around me. And I think now for young people who are going to college, they generally have to work part-time. Now, I did a wee bit of part-time work, but I got a very good grant. I got a full grant because there wasn't an income, you know, a big income coming into the house. So in that respect, I was very privileged.
And I know from different conversations we have had that you embrace trade unionism, socialism, iconic leaders, people who have campaigned around the conditions for others. Was this something that you got from university, or was it something that you brought to university?
Well, I think in terms of the organised labour movement, my family on both sides were rural people. And while they would have been involved in the nationalist struggle, on my mother's side in particular, they wouldn't have been part of the organised trade union movement. And I suppose when I started working, I got involved in the labour movement. And one of the pieces that inspired me really was the solidarity that I felt. So, you know, coming out as lesbian at the same time, where I did feel very much other, and in the initial stages, the trade union movement, as most people would be aware, wasn't all that female friendly or queer friendly, as I would call it, in the 70s. But once, you know, once the movement started to address those issues, there was a lot of solidarity, and if a motion had been passed at at the union conference, well, people did go with it. Yeah. Now, we did have to fight things like, women were very low profile, even in trade unions where the majority of the membership was female. So as part of some interesting conversations. And then I was aware too that I was very inspired by Inez McCormick. And when I went self-employed, I joined Unison. It was NUPE in those days. But she did a lot with the McBride principles, you know, and she kind of demonstrated to me in a very practical way how international solidarity and cooperation actually worked. And she did manage to shift at a time, and I suppose for many people listening, it's hard to believe, Joe, and I'm sure you find it the same. It's hard to believe, to say to people how much oppression there was here in the 60s and 70s. So Inez to get the trade union movement to back McBride principles, which was saying that trade unions in the US should not invest their pension funds in the north of Ireland unless there was, legislation to promote
equality and opportunity.
Yeah.
In fact, the room where I'm sitting on the other side of the partition wall, there is a portrait of Ennis McCormick. So she's never too far away from any of us. And she was an inspiration. You're absolutely right. To men and women. Uh, Let me take it back just a step. You're at a university. You've got a job. What was that? Was that at youth work at that stage?
Yeah, I got, and these were the days when jobs were plentiful, you know, that in terms of if you had a degree. So I worked, and that was, I suppose, what inspired me to go into education. I worked as a youth worker in the New Lodge, and I've great affection for the area still. We had the best crack, and in terms of health and safety, we worked in a building where there was no windows. It's now known, it was always known as the Recce.
Yeah.
Now it's been since taken over by Belfast City Council and fixed up. But, you know, there was a colour party at the disco on a Sunday night, you know, it was, I mean, I learned a lot. And, you know, had some really bizarre experiences, you know, taking 10, 16-year-old girls away camping, which was an absolute nightmare. You wouldn't be allowed to do it now. But and it was also, it just to experience the amount of, you know, death and destruction there was at that stage, you know, kids being shot dead by the army and stuff. And it was kind of like the injustice of it, and the number of young people I know who ended up serving time in jail for something that they didn't do, and maybe doing 10, 12 years in Long Kesh for, you know, because they were forced to sign a confession. But from there, I realized that in terms of, by this stage, I was gung-ho on social change, and I could see the injustice of the whole transfer test, the 11 plus. I still, you know, get really, really angry about judging children as failures at 11. It's just appalling. So I decided that I would train as a teacher. And I mean, it's long enough ago now that the school leaving age had just been raised to 16, and the education system didn't know what to do with all these young people who were, as they thought, forced to stay on in school. So I did a youth work course in Swansea. I didn't want to train as a Catholic teacher or in the state, or as I would call it, sort of like Protestant schools. So I went to Wales, and, you know, got introduced to group work, and I got inspired around adult education at that stage. And that was why I went to Liverpool, because they had a very radical adult education program in working class areas.
Just let me hold you there till I catch my breath. So to recap, so you came out of university, done very well, thank you. You are in one of the most youth intent locations in the city of Belfast, the New Lodge Road, Carrickhill, that lower part of the Antrim Road. You're dealing with children who have suffered all kinds and suffer all kinds of deprivation. I understand, I kind of get that, because with 5 siblings, you had to be a youth worker or a prison warder. There was no other hope for you. That's where you're going to one or the other. And then, if I'm right in reading listening to what you're saying, had you came out at that stage? Did you know that you were gay? Were you dealing with it? Where was it at?
No, I suppose I just always felt different. I mean, I had a boyfriend, because everybody did, kind of thing. And he was a very nice man, you know. He was a good person, still is. He's still alive and well. But it wasn't until I went to Liverpool that I suppose I got the opportunity to kind of stretch myself a bit and experience something different. And really, it wasn't like a great political decision. I fell in love with a woman, and that was it. And at that stage, I suppose I could say, I thought, look, if, you know, why couldn't I just go and get married and do the ordinary thing? Because my mother, particularly after my daddy died, if we put a foot wrong, she blamed herself for it. You know, if your daddy was alive, this wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, sure.
Kind of thing. But so it was like carrying it as a secret in the family, although eventually I told my brothers and my sister fairly soon after that, and with varying responses. I mean, I suppose it was completely new for me. And I remember somebody saying, "Does your mother know you're lesbian?" And I was looking around, who are they talking about? I just, as far as I had just fallen in love with a woman. But equally, as I said to one of our neighbours, we were reared to be very honest. It was okay to lie to the state authorities, but other than that, you had to be honest. So if anybody asked me, I said, yes, I am. And when I spent 6 years between Swansea and Liverpool, and then came back for family reasons. My uncle was seriously ill, and I decided not to put roots down in England. And so when I came back, and people were saying, well, you're very brave to come out. But in a way, Joe, as you know, things spread like wildfire. So people all knew, I didn't have to tell them. But people would come up to me at a trade union conference, women's conference, saying, oh, they're saying that you're gay. And I, as though it was an insult. And I said, well, no, actually, it's true.
But you paint that with respect. This is the latter half of the 70s.
Yeah, I came out in 77, 78.
And you paint that with respect as nearly like a walk through the park. This is at a time when there was intense discrimination against men and women for their sexual orientation. It was at a time when most people who were gay through necessity kept their heads down. It was at a time when there were court cases that had to be brought to Europe to decriminalize sexuality or your sexual choice. So it wasn't just, I mean, it took courage, and my opinion, looking at it from this side of the camera, it took courage to say, you said conferences, well, I am gay, and what about it?
Yeah, it was kind of like I suppose I did feel, although I didn't feel I fitted into any camp. I came back from Liverpool for a part-time job. I was the first worker in the first women's centre there was in the north of Ireland. It was 14 and a half hours a week. And, I had to take other part-time jobs in youth work to keep body and soul together. And for them, there was a sense of, in those days, that was in 81, and it was an ACE scheme, for those of you who are old enough to remember the ACE scheme, which was a pitiful wage, intending to get people off the dole. So I was regarded as, in many camps, I was regarded as not putting the best foot forward, because people said, oh, this feminism stuff, it's just all about lesbians, and hating men. And there was me, the worker, could I say very well qualified for it too, but
overly qualified, surely.
Well, probably, but it was like a heart project, and I learned so much. So I didn't quite fit in there because I was slightly suspicious because I was lesbian. Also, my politics were a bit suspect because I would regard myself as like a Republican, non-aligned, but and then in the Republican movement, I was regarded as a bit suspicious because I was lesbian and a feminist, and would, at every available opportunity would say, well, what about women? And as in your own good partner in crime, Janice would attest to, is that women in the Republican movement fought very hard to have their voice heard. And then, so I kind of felt a bit outside on a number of counts, but and I suppose it was more. I was talking about this today with a young gay fella. It's insults in the street I can take. It's like it's not water off a duck's back. It's not very pleasant, but it didn't affect me. It was more people who I considered allies and people I was close to. Their response was more hurtful, and just that feeling of not quite fitting in anywhere. And when I came back from England, I was very aware of that, of coming back as somebody with a lesbian identity. And at this stage, I didn't know anything really about lesbian women's role in, for example, 1916.
Yeah.
And I said, no, I'm coming back. I'm as Irish as the next person, because it was sort of implied to me that really, and Roger Casement was, mentioned as an example of that. It was said to me, oh, that was just British propaganda, that he was gay. And instead of celebrating, so at best in those days, the best you could expect was to be tolerated and not celebrated, which took a toll on my mental health.
Well, I was gonna ask you, the beginning of Out and Proud, the beginning of Gay Pride, the beginning of this energized grouping of young people, including yourself, who went on to form the LGBTQ plus community, and such courageous campaigns like the Rainbow Project and stuff like that. Was that an exciting period to be part of, and in fact, in your case, to be a leader of?
Yeah, but there was kind of a way, Joe, that I sort of soldiered on, and notice it's getting stuck in my throat. I did make an attempt to take my own life at one point, because I just find it all hard going. And so I have a lot of sympathy for, people say, oh, from the outside, I probably looked very confident and, up for anything. But as you know, there was an onus on us to do as much as we can. And I wasn't as brave as many as another person, and I wasn't doing, anything that I've done in life, aside from my 5-a-side football cup, which is here. It's not plastic. That's my main achievement. So, I always did it with other people who I looked up to, who were probably braver than I was. What I do know was that we drank an awful lot, that, and now that's called self-medication. But so we had good parties, and there was, as you'll be aware too, Joe, there was in those days when it was very tough, there was a sense of solidarity with those you were working with, and we had great, we had great celebrations. I ended up performing in a play that did a tour of the community centres in Belfast. It was very funny, so we had all sorts of things. And, music was very important. Writing was very important, hearing other women who were writing. So they, and at the time I was living with my sister and her 2 young children. So life felt very, very packed, full of stuff. So we didn't have much time to sit and explore what toll this was taking on people's emotional health. And the reason, I said I came back and I set up, a lot of women's studies courses I remember the first one was in Lenadoon.
Yes, of course.
And just, it was learning for me as well to be able to say to people, look, do you notice a difference in how men and women are treated? And of course, women did, but to be able to explore Irish history, to be able to talk about, economics to people and how the economics of the world works in terms of benefiting those who have more to get more.
It would be, I want to just stop you for a wee second, because it would be a miss of me and it would be inaccurate if I let you just skim over that period of your life. It wouldn't really be fair. And I know you're modest and I know you're shy and all of that. I just want to say for the record that this simply wasn't someone who lived a cozy existence and shared a home with her sister and her children. You were campaigning for people's rights. You were speaking at meetings. You were standing up. You were encouraging other people to find themselves and have that voice. So there was an intensity about what you were doing at that stage, which I have to say has helped to direct people and inspire people from the LGBTQ community still to this day. So let's not say, Mary, you kind of done wee bits of things and that was all. So just let me say that for the record. If you won't say it, then I'm quite happy to say it. So I want to move you on because our time is moving on.
Yeah. So
I know you've reinvented yourself by this stage of our conversation on at least 2 occasions, maybe 3 occasions. So psychotherapy, not the easiest task, and not someone that people do lightly. So how did you move into psychotherapy?
Well, as I say, I was teaching a lot of women's studies courses, in areas in Belfast. And I remember I was a founder member of the Shankill Women's Centre for my sins. I was on the board for 10 years. And I always said to people, look, I would have got, would have got less of a term for murder, But, and I noticed there, Joe, that there was a woman who came back to whatever class I ran every year, very intelligent, very bright woman, and they didn't move on. Their confidence didn't develop a lot. And they were really quite, way to describe it was like they sabotaged themselves. And so an opportunity came up to do a group work course, and I thought it was how to deal with conflict. And I did that. And then I was asked, would I be interested in training as a therapist? I didn't want to be a therapist particularly because I felt that it was group and collective activity that was going to change the world, not one-to-one. I still feel that the best thing you can do for your mental health is to go out and organize against the oppression, whatever it is that has caused your poor mental health. But those of us who've experienced poor mental health know that quite often we blame ourselves. If only I was stronger, better, wiser, more intelligent, I could cope with all of these different things. So I started doing that, and then I was getting more harassment at work for both my politics and my sexuality, and that's a quote from my boss. And decided that I couldn't cope with it any longer, and left a permanent pensionable job. There wasn't legislation that supported me taking action around, being challenged around my sexual orientation. And I suppose my confidence gradually got eroded. So I started doing work with organizations. I also learned, from working with women's studies in working class areas, that in fact, it was really important for people how they organized and to learn how to organize, particularly for women who were, rearing families, were holding communities together in those very dark times. And yet they didn't have the confidence when they were asked to stand up and speak and put their position. So I started doing work with organizations as well as work with individuals. And I suppose became more, some of it based on my own experience. Most of the things I've been involved in, Joe, was about making life better for me. So feeling that that the amount of stress and oppression that people here had to deal with as individuals, and that the the health service wasn't dealing with it. I suppose I was saying to you about the parties and stuff, but in the very early 80s, there were so many lesbian women who had problems with alcohol, and other drugs weren't available in those days. Now, younger people are more into prescription medication. So I tried to find people to refer them to, and there wasn't anybody. And this was the days before counselling was unheard of. So really, I trained in it because there was nobody else around, and have done a mixture of working with organisations, individuals and groups since then. That's now over 25 years ago.
25 years at the coalface. And I want to just confirm what you're saying. Counselling was believed to be either for film stars or the criminally insane. This was before the value of counselling was realised, and before, even now, it's quite difficult to get counselling. It's quite difficult to get quality counselling. But at that stage, it was unheard of. If you had told someone that you were going to see a counsellor, they would have crossed the street. Did you find? Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I do, people did sort of say to me, like in the middle of a war, what are you talking about?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, this is navel gazing, and it was regarded as something that had come from California.
Yeah.
And that this was like a luxury. Now, and that was part of in those days, as you'll be aware, Joe, people were expected to put their head down and just get on with it.
Yeah. Did you have all these things that are happening, spinning in your life, and things that are taking place and all of that. And I said in our introduction that I've known you for a long time, and we've been friends for a long time. Did you find it difficult, having embarked on this course of action, to leave your work in the office? You're counselling someone. Were you able to leave that and go home? Were you able to? I know that's a particular skill, and I know counsellors have a mechanism to do it, but did you find it difficult?
Well, most of my campaign and organisational work was not, it wasn't paid work as such, so I had to, like it was meetings in the evening or at weekends or whatever. I think all of us carried a lot of stuff. We do get training around how to deal with it. I don't think if I wasn't, that's the reason that I was involved in so many campaigns around LGBT or queer mental health, was because a woman called Judith Herman, who wrote what used to be called the Bible on Trauma, and she says you can't be a psychotherapist without also being an activist. So I have taken that with me, and I suppose one of the things that things that I'm proud of, Joe, was one was an event which was part of Failure, which is, it's important to mention, called Irish Queer and Equal. And again, Clarnaman, an organisation that I was founder member of, organised it to bring together that those, can you be Irish and queer at the same time? And we got a group of queer Black and Irish Americans who came over and talked about the difficulties they had in the civil rights movement, facing homophobia, and then in the kind of LGBT plus movement is facing a lot of racism. And we were kind of asking the question, is that similar here? And it does hold us back in terms of achieving equality, is the fact that and people tend to say, in queer rights, everybody's the same as everybody else. And that's not, in fact, the case. So we held this event. It was jam-packed, full of, there was quite a few unionists there, as well as as local people, Jerry Adams opened it, and it kind of opened up some sort of a discussion, is saying that LGBTQ rights aren't just something that happens downtown in and I was to be told that in the Shankill Women's Centre. I was told that, oh yeah, that's where, the lesbians are downtown. They don't live in our community, even though
Of course they, yeah.
I had a few run-ins with the Shankill Road dikes, some of which are quite funny. But so that kind of brought them together. And I noticed that when the war ended here, the Troubles, as some people call it, that it actually, it liberated certainly the likes of myself to be more actively involved in trying to create facilities, resources, services for, and to raise the issue of queer rights.
Can I ask you a question? Because all of our viewers won't be familiar with some of the terminology that we use. You describe yourself as queer. I would describe you as gay. Can you explain to me why do you choose the word queer?
Well, first of all, my name's Quiery, which is and that's
That's a coincidence.
Yeah. So really, I had to kind of, embrace it. Even at school, they would say me queer by name, queer by nature.
Yeah, sure.
But I suppose gay is a term I would associate with usually with men, although a lot of young people, and now it's common parlance, everybody talks about being gay.
Yeah.
And sometimes I would use it as a shortcut. But both, lesbian's a very female-rooted identity, and queer implies that there is a political agenda attached to it. It's not just about who you sleep with. It's how stereotypes, force inequality to continue. And I'm not just talking about, gay rights. I'm talking about socioeconomic rights as well.
Yeah, right.
So queer, the queer agenda would see that not everybody is the same. That certainly as a white middle-class gay man, you've a much different, I suppose, outcome in your life than you would have as a Black working class, lesbian somewhere. And so queer acknowledges more of that. Also, just, in terms of saying it, lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer, intersex, it goes on. So it's but some people do react to it, and when I'm working with people, I always check with them what happens for them when I use the term queer. And for some people, there's a very strong reaction because it was used as a term of abuse.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And still can be, but it's also about reclaiming the word.
No, I know that had I not have asked you that question, that when we put this interview out, that there would be calls. Is it a derogatory term? Why you said that? We have been speaking for 55 months. Amazing as that seems. And you were worried before we started the program that you had nothing interesting to say. And I suspect you will be pleasantly surprised by the reaction. I want to spend the last 5 minutes in just...
There's one more thing I really want to mention that I am very proud of. And because it involved my mother, it was when Lassie, Lesbian Advocacy Services Initiative, although as I said to Nelson McCausland, it's Ulster Scots for lesbian, Lassie, but I was asked to do a piece of research. I was involved in the group, and then I did a piece of research into the lives of lesbian and bisexual women in the north of Ireland. And I was determined after talking to people, and I talked to ex-prisoners, both Republican and, well, there weren't any loyalist ex-prisoners, but to, loyalist lesbian women. And I was determined that this would be properly launched in Stormont. And I decided, look, it was all too much. I wouldn't ask my mother. And then my aunt found out and she just invited herself. So I had to invite my mommy. And I always felt she kind of tolerated really me and my opinions rather than being proud. But I was always pleased that the rector of Clonard Monastery came up to her and said to her, "You must be very proud of your daughter." And he knew that that was something that was important to my mother, who was a very devout Catholic, to hear that. And that was such, that felt like real support for me. But I was delighted. It was the first ever, out queer event at Stormont. I have a fabulous picture of us all, and there was men and women there sitting on the steps. And that is something I was so proud of and so delighted.
And the building didn't collapse.
No, and as I say, it's the first out. There was a lot of queer men and women who
absolutely. And of course, that's where it should be. What I was going to ask you, and I'm glad you brought that point, because I was going to ask you earlier, and I thought I wouldn't, how your mother dealt with your sexuality, and you explained that to us. How do you relax? What do you do when you're not fighting battles and waging campaigns?
Well, swimming is my thing. I've never had a swimming lesson in my life, and I taught myself very painfully over a number of years. But there's liberation in the water. So with the lockdown, I haven't been able to swim in a pool. I was swimming, sort of 2 and 3 kilometers. I'm not, as I said to you before, I'm not wondrous at anything, but I am so proud of swimming and the freedom it gives you. So I've had to take to the sea, which is, I gave up in February. It was just too cold. But in the sea, so that swimming is a big deal to me. And I like to walk as well. Read. I love singing, even though my voice is largely gone now. But and it's not so much, it's like going back to the family parties. It wasn't so much whether you could sing, it's about your choice of party piece.
Yeah.
So there's some songs that I love to hear just being sung.
And I said again when we began this interview, you were a regular to the James Connolly Folk Club night here in RSG Connolly, and you made a great contribution, I have to say. Both in terms of your own singing ability and also encouraging others. And it's not about how well you sing. It's about that involvement and that kind of collectiveness about doing all of that. We're nearly at the very end. And I said somewhere along the lines that you had invented and reinvented and reinvented yourself over a period. All the days weren't filled full of sunshine, and there weren't stars in every night sky. But has it been an adventure for you?
Oh yeah. I mean, as I said, I've been very lucky in the people that I've met, in the adventures that I have, and it's all of that mixing of. What people tend to see identities as separate, but I'm just Mary Quiery from Newtonard still, and didn't I get far? So well, I learned so much, and it's one of the things I learned in Liverpool is I'd be eternally grateful to African Americans and Black people for what they taught me. It was a Black British woman who said to me, "Don't talk about the famine." It was the Great Hunger and Gordon Moore. There was no famine. That they've been such an inspiration down the years. But yes, it's been an adventure, and I've had some great parties along the way.
Well, can I close this interview because we are at a time. So Mary Quiery from Newtonards, thank you for being a wonderful guest, and thank you for being a wonderful friend. Thank you, Cormac. Thank you.
Cormac.